Hi everyone, this is new crime story video, so don't waste the time. Let's go to the video.
Hello everyone, my name is David. Today we are going to take a look at another real story with you. Life and death are in the hands of God. Usually a doctor issues the death certificate, but there are many cases where someone falls ill or suddenly dies at home without ever going to a hospital or seeing a doctor. We all know this happens. In 2011, in Russia, a woman was declared dead by a doctor. After that, her body was brought home. Once at home, preparations for the funeral began. Everything was being arranged when suddenly, the woman, the one who had been declared dead by the doctor, sat up. She sat up and looked around to see what was happening. Everyone was shocked. Then she asked for tea, drank it, and the next day she passed away. But on that day, when the certificate was issued, she was alive. Forget Russia. You may have heard many such stories where someone was declared dead but later found alive. But would you believe that in this very world, there was a woman who was buried alive not once, but twice? In earlier times, when science and technology hadn't advanced much, there were many difficulties. Today, we're very lucky to have access to so many things in the medical field, and beyond that, make life easier. Back in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, during pandemics like cholera, it said that many people would fall unconscious, out of fear, just like during COVID. When people were afraid to touch the dead, they would be buried. Later, it would be discovered that many of them weren't actually dead, just unconscious, but they had already been buried alive. Many such mistakes happened in the past, but this story is completely different. This is a story from England, from Hampshire, where a couple used to live, a husband and wife. The husband's name was William Blunden, and his wife was Mrs. Alice Blunden. Their life was happy. Everything was going well. William Blunden worked at a liquor distillery, and he had a decent job. Because the distillery or factory was far from their home, he was often away for work, so he would only come home occasionally during holidays. Since he worked at a liquor factory, he also had a taste for brandy and used to drink it. One day, while he was away at work back at home, there were many ingredients used for making liquor stored in the house. In that area, farming was common, and opium was also grown. A container of opium-infused water was kept at home. Mrs. Blunden, William's wife, didn't know it was opium water. She picked it up and drank it. After a while, she lost consciousness. She had no idea what was happening, and unknowingly, she drank a large amount of it all at once. A while later, some relatives and neighbors who lived nearby came over, wondering why she hadn't been seen all day. When they entered the house, they found her unconscious on the floor. People panicked and quickly called for a doctor. Now, of course, calling meant sending for the doctor back. Then this was a different time. The doctor arrived holding a small mirror in his hand. He checked her pulse and other signs, then placed the mirror near her nose and mouth to check for breath. After a short while, he declared that she was dead. This was the year 1674. The story took place on July 15th, 1674. This was a time when medical science and technology weren't very advanced. There were no ECG machines or other tools to confirm whether a person was alive or dead. Still, like every era, there were people, illnesses, and doctors. Back then, there was a unique method used to declare whether someone was alive or dead. If there was any doubt about a person, if their heartbeat and pulse couldn't be felt, the method was to take a glass mirror and hold it very close to the person's mouth and nose. They would then check the glass in the area near the person's nose and mouth to see if any moisture appeared. Just like in winter when we breathe and a foggy mark appears on a car window or a mirror at home, the same idea was used. The mirror was held close to the nose and mouth to check if the person was still breathing. If they were alive, their breath would create a foggy mark on the glass. That slight mist or condensation was a sign of life. That's why the doctor also brought a mirror with him, and it was said that this method with the mirror was very effective. It had never failed. Whenever doctors used it on someone they suspected might be dead, they would hold the mirror near the person's mouth and nose. If they saw signs of breath fog or mist on the glass, they would immediately say the person was alive. But if the mirror remained clear, plain, and clean with no sign of condensation, they would declare the person dead. When Alice Blunden was unconscious, the doctor arrived and used the same method. He placed the mirror near her nose and mouth several times, but the mirror remained clear, no fog, no signs of breath. So the doctor said, "Inform her husband she has passed away." Everyone was filled with grief and sorrow. Her husband was far away, so the plan was to wait for him to return for the funeral. However, the neighbors and relatives raised a concern. They said it would take at least a day or more for him to come, and they questioned how the body would be kept that long. Remember, this was in the year 1674, a time when there were no large freezers or proper facilities in hospitals to preserve bodies. And even if such arrangements existed, they were far too expensive and out of reach for ordinary or poor people. So in that situation, people were worried about how to preserve the body. There was the risk of it decaying, and they were also afraid. Many of them believed that keeping a body for too long was inauspicious, a bad omen. The doctor advised waiting for the husband to return, but the relatives and neighbors said there was no point in waiting and insisted on going ahead with the funeral. So, by majority decision, it was agreed that Alice Blunden's body would be buried on the same day, July 15th. Back then, cemeteries were open fields, coffins were handmade, and all arrangements were done by the local people. These were poor folks, so things weren't very beautiful or fancy. Orders were given quickly to get everything done in a hurry. Alice Blunden was a bit heavy, she had quite a lot of weight, so it was very difficult to place her inside the coffin. The coffin was small, so they had to bend her arms and legs to fit her in. Then, on July 15th, 1674, she was taken to a cemetery in the same area called South View Cemetery. There, she was buried. The entire neighborhood, all the relatives, and even the doctor were present. Although the doctor wanted them to wait for the husband, the relatives didn't agree, so the doctor didn't insist any further, and she was buried in cemetery. After the burial, everyone returned home. The next day, Alice's husband, William Blunden, received the message. He rushed back and went straight to his wife's grave. There, he placed a plaque on the grave, and on that plaque was written, "Wife of William Blunden, Mrs. Blunden, date, July 15th, 1674. This was written at that time. After placing the plaque, the husband returned from the cemetery. Then came July 17th. 2 days passed since Alice Blunden's death. People were still mourning and in shock. Meanwhile, next to that same cemetery, there was a school. The area around the cemetery was open, so the school children often wandered there while playing. On July 17th, 2 children went to Southview Cemetery after school and were playing around when they suddenly heard a strange sound. Curious, they followed the sound and listened closely. They realized the noise was coming from beneath one of the graves. At first, they were scared, but they kept listening to make sure it wasn't some kind of prank. Among all the graves, they identified one from which the sound was the loudest. Terrified by what they heard, they ran off immediately. After After running away, the kids first reached their school. They went straight to the headmaster and told him that they heard crying and screaming sounds coming from one of the graves. The headmaster thought they were just being mischievous and scolded them. He accused them of making up stories and even fined them as punishment. Then he sent them away. But after sending them off, the headmaster started thinking. These kids had never made such complaints before, and although many students often played near the cemetery, no one had ever reported anything like this. This was the first time such a strange and unusual complaint had been made, and the children had specifically pointed out which grave the sound was coming from, the same grave where Mrs. Blunden had been buried just 2 days earlier. The teacher also knew about Mrs. Blunden's death, so he started to feel that maybe the kids were telling the truth. He decided to go and verify it for himself. That evening, he went to the cemetery. Slowly, he made his way toward Mrs. Blunden's grave. At first, everything was silent. He waited for a while, and then suddenly, he heard faint sobs and muffled cries coming from inside the grave. To confirm what he was hearing, he moved in closer. He placed his ear very close to the grave and felt something strange. He could hear a sound from inside, as if someone was struggling to get out. The headmaster realized the children had been telling the truth. He panicked and ran back to the neighborhood. He went straight to William Blunden's house and said, "There are sounds coming from your wife's grave." At first, people thought he was imagining things or mistaken, but neighbors also started talking. Some had heard the sounds too. And now it had already been 2 days since the burial. So how could there still be any sound? Still unsure, they said, "Come and hear it yourself." William was hesitant at first, but eventually he agreed and went with them to the grave. As he stood by his wife's grave and waited, he actually heard something coming from inside. Others heard it too, but many were scared, thinking it might be a ghost or spirit. But William felt something else, something real. However, at that time, the law stated that no grave could be opened without official permission, and no one could exhume a body on their own. Even so, William said, "There's a voice coming from inside. We need to dig." Now, the headmaster, being an educated man, insisted they get proper permission from the authorities first, so some people rushed to the government office. But by then, it was already evening and night was approaching. The official said, "We can't open the grave at night. You'll have to wait until morning." By the next morning, July 18th, all the paperwork was completed. A few government officials, along with the locals, went to the same grave from which the sounds had been heard. They began digging it up. The grave was about 4 feet deep. When they finally reached the coffin and opened it, everyone was stunned. The body they had buried and the body they now saw looked very different. The shroud and clothing on Mrs. Blunden were torn. There were bloodstains on her fingernails, and it looked like she had scratched the inside of the coffin lid with her nails in a desperate attempt to escape. The top of the coffin had visible scratch marks and bloodstains. Her body had visible injuries. Seeing all this, it became clear to everyone that the sounds they had been hearing for the past 2 days were real. She had been alive, struggling to get out. She was finally removed from the coffin and then taken away. They took her to the doctor, and the doctor said, "She's alive." It felt like a miracle, but even the doctor was shocked. The same mirror, the glass he had used to check whether she was alive or dead, had never failed before. Every time he had tested it on someone, it worked. That small mirror was the only tool they had at that time to determine life or death. The doctor was stunned. He said, "I placed the mirror near her nose and mouth several times, very closely, and not once did I see a single sign of breath." But now, the coffin itself tells a different story. Because when Mrs. Blunden was buried, her body had been properly bathed, dressed, and laid out peacefully. But now, her clothes were torn. There was blood under her nails, and the wooden coffin had deep scratch marks, clear signs she had been alive and struggling to escape. The whole village now believed she had been alive. Her treatment began immediately, and they worked on her all day, continuing into the evening. But by nightfall, she lost consciousness again. The doctor had already left, but he was called back. He came again and examined everything. Once more, he took out the same mirror and held it near Mrs. Blunden's nose and mouth to check if she was breathing. After placing it several times, he finally stepped back and, with a heavy heart, said, sadly, she was no longer alive, she had died. But the truth was, she could have been saved, because the first time she was buried, she was still alive. She had struggled inside the coffin, but there was no ventilation, no air, nothing to help her survive. Still, she had fought, and even then, she still had life in her. But after being brought out, she passed away. Many people were in disbelief. They asked the doctor to check again. The doctor confirmed multiple times. Finally, he declared that she had indeed died. They waited until morning. Then, once again, Mrs. Blunden was buried in the same grave where she had first been laid to rest on July 15th, but this time in a new coffin. However, this time they did one thing differently. The coffin was not sealed completely. They left it slightly adjustable, just in case on the off chance that, by some miracle, she was still alive. She wouldn't have difficulty getting out. Although the doctor clearly said she was truly dead now, they still took that precaution. She was placed in the new coffin and buried again in the same cemetery. After the burial, the villagers and family made one more decision. They would assign a guard to stay near the grave for the next 48 hours. The guard's only responsibility was to watch over that grave. And if any sound came from inside the grave, because, who knows, she might come back to life again, scream, or call for help. The guard was instructed to alert everyone immediately, so she could be rescued in time. The government department had also given prior written permission that if any such sound was heard, the grave could be opened right away without any delay, and if she was alive, even better. So, a guard was officially assigned to watch over the grave. Once again, Mrs. Blunden was buried in the same grave. Everyone returned home, and night fell. She had been buried that morning, and a guard was posted the next day to take night duty. That night, it became cold, and it also started raining. As night fell, the guard thought, who's going to come to a cemetery in this weather? With the cold and rain, he felt he needed some comfort. Quietly, he slipped away to a nearby pub, a local one he knew where he started drinking. He forgot all about the grave and spent the entire night drinking. By morning, he suddenly remembered he had a duty. Not wanting anyone to find out, he rushed back to the cemetery. But as he arrived, he suddenly began to hear sounds again, coming from the same grave. Terrified, he panicked. But this time, the guard didn't hide anything. He immediately reported that sounds were coming from the grave. People rushed back. Since they already had official permission, the grave was dug up again. When they opened it, the coffin was not in its original position. Its lid was pushed off. Her clothes were torn again. Her nails had blood on them just like before, and the signs of struggle to escape were clearly visible. Everyone was shocked to see it. They pulled her body out once more. But this time, the doctor checked everything thoroughly. There were no signs of breathing, no signs of life. He examined her for a while from every angle. When the doctor was completely sure, using the same mirror and all other methods, they finally decided to bury her again. So, for the third time, Mrs. Blunden was buried in the same grave. After that, no sounds ever came from the grave again. Later, the doctor admitted that the first time she was buried, she was probably unconscious due to the heavy dose of opium. Her breathing had slowed significantly, and her pulse had become very faint, so faint that the mirror test failed to detect it. When she was first taken out, she was actually alive, and even after being removed from the coffin, she was still breathing. But the mirror still failed to show any sign of life, and eventually, she died. According to the doctor, when she was buried the second time, she still wasn't completely dead, she was alive. That means one person, Mrs. Blunden, was buried alive not just once, but twice in the same grave. and it was only the third time that she was actually dead when she was buried. When this story came to light, her husband William was devastated. He hadn't been there when his wife died, and during his absence, the neighbors and relatives insisted on burying her quickly, fearing the body would decay. Even though the doctor had advised waiting, they went ahead anyway. After the third burial, William realized that his wife could have been saved if only they had waited for him to return, and hadn't rushed to bury her. The case eventually reached the authorities and police. It was revealed that the woman had been wrongly buried alive, not once, but twice. The doctor was the first to be held accountable, and then notices were sent to all the people who had participated in the burial, including the neighbors and relatives. They were all considered responsible. Technically, they could have been charged with murder because, at that time, wrongful burial resulting in death could lead to the death penalty. However, the doctor defended himself, saying, "When I examined her the first time, I found no signs of life at all. Although my mirror had never failed before that glass test still, how she was alive afterward, I don't know. The second time we took her out, she had a little bit of life left, but soon after, there was nothing. So I declared her dead. I was the one who gave the final death certificate," the doctor said. Since the doctor had officially declared her dead, people naturally trusted the doctor. Because of this one statement, all the people involved in the funeral, the ones who had buried her, were saved from being charged with murder, which at the time carried the death penalty. However, the local parliament still took action. They fined every person who had been involved in her funeral. Each one was ordered to pay a monetary penalty, and it was enforced. But that wasn't all. The single incident which happened in London couldn't spark the wave of awareness. Back then, there were many cases where unconscious people were mistakenly buried alive. There had been growing confusion between unconsciousness and death, and many who were still alive were buried without anyone realizing it. So reforms began. New coffin designs were introduced. Some coffins were even fitted with bells so that if someone was mistakenly buried alive and regained consciousness, they could ring the bell and alert people outside. Some coffins were even designed with ventilation systems, so that if someone was buried alive, at least they wouldn't die from suffocation. They might still have a chance to survive or try to escape. These changes were gradually introduced and continued for many years. But as the 19th and 20th centuries arrived, the world changed. That mirror test placing a glass near the nose and mouth became useless. You could no longer certify life or death just by checking for breath. After that, machines took over. A medical revolution began, and such cases became far less common. Still, as I mentioned earlier, there have been exceptions. In 2011, a woman in Russia suddenly sat up during her own funeral. She had been declared dead. There are many such cases, but these are less about miracles and more about medical negligence. Many times, people have been wrongly declared dead by doctors and later found alive. Strange and unbelievable cases like these happen in this world more often than we realize. So this was today's story. Thank you for joining us on this.
Also, this is very amazing story. You like this? I hope like this. So like the video and don't forget to subscribe. Bye bye.